TPUSA since Charlie was killed, just so you guys know this is a fact, has made more than $100 million. That is separate from the $40 million they made at Mar-a-Lago.
Picture of her kids holding her husband's book. Then a video comes out and she's giggling 2 weeks after he passed, and she's talking about merchandise sales. I mean, she could have done
The internet didn't expect this alliance, and that's exactly why it exploded. When Candace Owens reportedly aligned with a close family insider connected to Charlie Kirk, attention snapped into focus. Not for drama, for receipts. Fans began revisiting donation drives, fundraising language, and how trust was built, and then leveraged. As breakdowns spread, supporters felt a jolt of disbelief. Screenshots circulated, timelines tightened, and questions that once felt unthinkable suddenly became unavoidable. This isn't about gossip or infighting. It's about accountability to the base that believed in the mission and opened their wallets. As analysis mounted, the narrative shifted from loyalty to oversight, from faith to verification. With social feeds filled with stunned reactions as #TPUSA trended alongside calls to follow the money. If these claims hold weight, they don't just challenge leadership, they challenge how movements treat their supporters. And once fans feel misled, the fallout moves fast. The moment this collaboration was rumored, the reaction wasn't excitement, it was shock. Not because of personalities, but because of proximity. When Candace Owens appeared to align with a member of Charlie Kirk's own family, attention immediately shifted from commentary to credibility. Family proximity changes how claims are received. It raises the stakes, even before evidence is discussed. What followed was not an accusation storm. It was an audit mindset. Supporters began revisiting past fundraising pushes connected to Turning Point USA, donation language, a campaign urgency, emotional appeals tied to mission and loyalty. None of this was new, but the lens was. Fans weren't assuming wrongdoing. They were asking whether expectations matched outcomes. Social media reflected that shift instantly. Hashtags like #TPUSA funds and #follow the money began circulating, not as verdicts, but as prompts. Comment sections filled with questions instead of conclusions. Screenshots of donation pages and promotional emails resurfaced. The tone was measured, but the volume was undeniable. What made this moment different was who was asking. These weren't outside critics, they were long-time supporters, people who had donated, shared links, and defended the organization in the past. Their shock wasn't outrage, it was realization. The realization that loyalty doesn't replace oversight. Candace's involvement added another layer. Her reputation for internal critique, rather than external attacks, signaled to audiences that this wasn't a partisan hit. It was framed as accountability. And accountability, even when framed cautiously, unsettles systems built on trust. By the end of this phase, one thing was clear. The story wasn't about exposure yet. It was about expectation. And once supporters start measuring expectations against reality, the narrative doesn't need allegations to move forward. It moves on scrutiny alone. As the conversation deepened, the focus narrowed from personalities to process. Supporters stopped reacting to headlines and started reviewing mechanics. Where did the money go? How were appeals framed? What expectations were created, and were they ever clarified afterward? This phase didn't explode. It accumulated. Donation screenshots resurfaced across platforms, not as proof of wrongdoing, but as prompts for verification. Language that once felt motivational was reread with a colder eye. Urgency was compared against outcomes. And the gap between promise and perception became the center of attention. Mentions of Turning Point USA rose alongside hashtags like #accountability-first and #verify-before-trust. Comment sections filled with requests for transparency rather than accusations. That distinction mattered. The base wasn't alleging fraud, it was asking for receipts. What amplified the scrutiny was the framing around family proximity. When claims are associated with insiders, even indirectly, audiences assume access to context. That assumption doesn't need confirmation to influence perception. It simply raises the bar for explanation. Analyses linked to Candace Owens emphasized methodology over motive. Viewers were encouraged to examine timelines, not intentions. That approach shifted the conversation from emotion to evaluation, which kept it alive longer and spread it wider. By the end of this phase, one reality had settled in. Trust alone was no longer sufficient. Supporters wanted clarity that could withstand scrutiny. And once money enters the conversation, the demand for clarity becomes relentless. By this stage, the conversation crossed a psychological threshold. Supporters were no longer waiting for clarification from the top. They began auditing from the bottom. This is the moment when movements lose narrative insulation, because the base starts doing the math itself. Crowdsourced scrutiny took over. Donation campaigns were lined up side by side. Our fundraising language from different time periods was compared for consistency. Viewers didn't claim deception, they questioned transparency. They asked whether expectations were clearly defined, whether outcomes were measurable, and whether supporters were ever shown how impact was tracked. This is where trust quietly transforms into verification. Across platforms, spreadsheets, and archived links began circulating, not to accuse, but to document. Hashtags like #ShowTheReceipts and #TransparencyMatters trended alongside #TPUSA. These weren't hostile tags. They were procedural. And procedural scrutiny is the hardest to deflect. The involvement of Candace Owens continued to frame the moment as internal accountability rather than opposition. Her presence signaled to supporters that questioning was not betrayal. It was responsibility. That framing gave permission for deeper examination without fear of social backlash. Meanwhile, references to Turning Point USA were increasingly paired with calls for audits, disclosures, and clearer reporting. Not demands for punishment, demands for process. Fans wanted to know how decisions were made and who oversaw them. This phase mattered because it changed the power dynamic. Once supporters begin self-auditing, leadership loses the ability to reset the narrative with messaging alone. Facts, clear or absent, become the only stabilizer. By the end of this phase, one truth was undeniable. The base was no longer stunned. It was engaged. And engagement of this kind doesn't fade quietly. As self-auditing spread, the conversation entered a more serious phase. This wasn't about curiosity anymore, it was about implications. Supporters began realizing that even without proven wrongdoing, perception alone can reshape trust. And trust is the foundation of any donor-driven movement. The tone across platforms hardened, not into anger, but into expectation. Viewers started asking what accountability should look like when large sums of money are raised under emotionally charged messaging. They compared donor communications to outcomes. They examined whether transparency was proactive or reactive. And they asked whether internal oversight matched the scale of public support. Mentions of Turning Point USA increasingly appeared alongside phrases like governance, controls, and reporting standards. This wasn't cancellation energy. It was institutional pressure, the kind that doesn't fade with time. It grows with silence. Importantly, the scrutiny wasn't centralized. No single voice controlled it. That decentralization made it resilient. Even as some threads cooled, others reignited elsewhere. New audiences entered already oriented, already skeptical, already expecting clarity. The presence of Candace Owens continued to anchor the framing as internal accountability rather than external attack. That distinction mattered because it kept supporters engaged instead of defensive. When accountability comes from within the ideological tent, it carries different weight. By now, fans weren't asking if explanations would come. They were asking how sufficient those explanations would need to be to restore confidence. The bar had moved, and it wasn't moving back on its own. This is the phase where reputations don't collapse, but they recalibrate, where momentum doesn't disappear, but it slows. and where leadership learns that transparency isn't a response to crisis, it's a requirement to prevent one. By this point, the conversation had shifted from what might be wrong to what needs to change. That transition is subtle but decisive. It marks the moment when supporters stop waiting for reassurance and start adjusting their behavior. Engagement patterns revealed it first. Donation-related posts received fewer reflexive endorsements. Calls to action were met with questions instead of applause. Longtime supporters who once shared links automatically now hesitated, asking for clarity before amplification. This wasn't rebellion, it was restraint. And restraint signals fracture. Across platforms, the language evolved again. Hashtags like #pause and verify and #trust needs transparency replaced earlier investigative tags. The tone wasn't hostile, it was guarded. Fans weren't walking away, they were stepping back, creating distance, reassessing alignment. This phase matters because movements don't lose credibility overnight. They lose it incrementally, through micro-decisions made by individuals who no longer feel certain. When those individuals are the base, the impact compounds quietly. Observers noted how explanations, where they existed, felt insufficient to meet the new standard of scrutiny. Not because they were false, but because they were incomplete. The base had already moved beyond surface-level reassurance. It wanted structure, oversight, and visibility. At the same time, the framing around accountability remained internal. The conversation wasn't about punishment or takedowns. It was about stewardship, or about whether leadership recognized that trust, once questioned, must be rebuilt deliberately, not defended instinctively. By the end of this phase, one outcome was clear. Momentum had slowed, confidence had thinned, and the burden of proof had shifted. From here on, silence wouldn't just prolong scrutiny, it would define it. By the final phase, the story stopped evolving through discovery and began settling into consequence. Not legal consequence, not verdicts, but reputational gravity, the kind that reshapes how audiences listen, donate, and believe going forward. This is where movements are tested. The base didn't turn hostile, it turned discerning. Supporters recalibrated expectations, no longer assuming alignment equaled accountability. They began separating belief in a mission from confidence in execution. That distinction, once introduced, never fully disappears. Mentions of Turning Point USA stabilized into a new pattern across platforms. Fewer spikes, more sustained scrutiny. Hashtags like #trust, but verify, and #accountability. Matters replaced investigative tags, signaling a shift from exposure to expectation. The audience wasn't asking for spectacle, it was asking for structure. The involvement of Candace Owens continued to frame the moment as internal reckoning rather than external attack. That framing mattered. It kept the conversation anchored in stewardship and responsibility, values the base recognizes as non-negotiable. By now, the outcome wasn't about proving claims. It was about restoring confidence. And confidence, once fractured, requires more than statements. It requires transparency that can withstand audits, timelines that align with outcomes, and oversight that is visible, not implied. This is the lasting impact, not scandal, not collapse, but a permanent shift in how trust is granted. From here forward, the base will remember this moment as a turning point, when loyalty matured into oversight and expectation became the standard. And in a donor-driven movement, that change is everything. Now the spotlight shifts to you. This story isn't about picking sides. It's about protecting trust. If you donated, shared links, or defended the mission, your voice matters more than ever. Read the timelines again, compare the claims, and decide what accountability should look like next. Drop a comment with the questions you still want answered and the transparency you expect going forward. Share this breakdown so supporters can make informed choices, not emotional ones. To tag creators who value receipts over rhetoric. Follow outlets that archive updates before narratives change. Engagement drives visibility, so engage with purpose. Follow for ongoing coverage and verified updates. At Breaking Narratives, at Media Watchers, at Legacy Watch, #TPUSA, #accountability, #transparency, matters, #follow the money, #donor trust, #media, literacy, #stay informed, #hold leaders accountable. Save this thread, subscribe for alerts, and revisit it as facts evolve. Because responsible movements improve through scrutiny, clear reporting, independent audits, and leadership that welcomes questions.